Hello, virtual friends. Let's go ahead and get started with what we have going on today in reading. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce your spelling 11 list because yes, you are starting spelling this week. I'm also going to tell you guys about making connections before we get into reading our book because of Winn-Dixie. We're also going to kind of just talk about how the things that we thought of before we read last week. And then we're going to read chapters 1 and 2 of Because of Winn-Dixie. So let's go ahead and get started. So here is your spelling 11 list. I'm going to ahead and, sorry guys. I'm going to go ahead and read them off to you. And this spelling list will be posted on your file section in your Teams so that you guys can refer to it throughout the week. I will also have them attached to your assignments where you need them. All right, so number 1 is bargain, bargain. Number 2 is journey, journey. Number 3 is pattern, pattern. Number 4 is arrive, arrive. Number 5 is object, object. Number 6 is suppose, suppose. Number 7 is shoulder, shoulder. Number 8 is permit, permit. Number 9 is sorrow, sorrow. Number 10 is tunnel, tunnel. Number 11 is subject, subject. Number 12 is custom, custom. Number 13 is suggest, suggest. Number 14 is perhaps, perhaps. And number 15 is lawyer, lawyer. All right, my friends. So the main thing that I want us to focus on as we do these read aloud books together is I want us to focus on making connections. Now, there are going to be many other things that I want us to focus on as we start reading more and more books. But because of Winn-Dixie, I want us to start with making connections. Now, making connections can be from text to text, text to self, and text to world. So let me go ahead and explain those to you guys. So we're going to start with text to text connections. Now, connections are something that something that you connect with, something that you see similar, something that you see different, something that you notice, something that you believe in. And with text to text connections, this is a connection between the book and another book or text you have read. So as we read Because of Winn-Dixie, you may make text-to-text connections with another book that you've read. So as you hear something happening in Winn-Dixie, you might be like, hey, wait, that happened in another book that I've read. Then we have text-to-self connections. Now, this is a connection between the book and your life experiences. Now, this one is the most common one that you're going to see because you as an individual have gone through as many things as 9 and 10-year-olds have so far, but you've seen a lot and you know a good amount. I give you that. So there's things that you can make a connection with. Just because you're not an adult doesn't mean you won't be able to make these connections. I guarantee you will. So I think we're gonna have to focus on text to self a little bit, just a little bit more. And then there's text to world connections. This is a connection between the book and events in the real world. So any connection that we see in Because of Winn-Dixie that makes you think, oh, hey, that happened in so-and-so place, or anything that's bigger than the school or bigger than your home or bigger than Texas and the United States, that is a world connection. So I am going to go ahead and get started with sharing with you guys Because of Winn-Dixie. If I can get okay, here we go. Okay, so I want you guys to look at the book cover here. I think it's the absolute cutest because you guys know I'm a huge dog person, as I know many of you are so far from getting to know you guys. But I want you guys to look at this book cover and kind of just think about what stands out to you. Well, besides the obvious cute dog here, but what else on this book cover stands out to you? Is there anything about the dog that stands out to you? Anything about what else is on the book cover that stands out to you? just take a second to pause the video and just kind of see, like, oh, what do I notice about it? Does it say anything? Is there like anything with it that looks different? Like, what's going on with this book cover that stands out to me? Because wink, wink, you're going to have to answer this question later. So go ahead and take a look. All right, you guys know how to work a pause button. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading because I'm excited. So this is Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. So let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 1. My name is India Opal Bologna, and last summer, my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes, and I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn-Dixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. My friends, I think we've already got a text-to-self connection here. Have you ever encountered someone who seemed red-faced, screaming, and waving their arms around? I know I have. What do you think it means? What do you think it means? I want to know what you think it means by a red-faced, screaming, and waving their arms around. So if I'm red in the face and I'm screaming at something and I'm waving my arms around, what kind of feeling would I be having? What am I feeling? Am I happy? I don't think so. Angry. Oh, I just spilled it. I spilled the beans. So usually the red-faced screaming and waving his arms around, that kind of gives us like an angry feeling. Maybe we've seen it in a movie that we've seen, or maybe you made a text-to-text connection and you've read something similar to this description of an angry person in another book. But when I think of someone who's angry, I always think of them like so red in the face. They're so angry, or they're screaming because they're so angry, or their hands are just everywhere because they're so angry. Keep that text-to-self connection in mind. Let's continue. Who let a dog in here? He kept on shouting. Who let a dirty dog in here? At first, I didn't see a dog. There was just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers, and there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn-Dixie employees running around, waving their arms just the same way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly. Did you hear that? She called him ugly. And he looked like he was having a real good time. His tongue was hanging out and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I had never before in my life seen a dog smile, but that is what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth. Then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked some oranges off a display and they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog." The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. You could tell that all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow he ended up knocking the manager over. The manager must have been having a bad day because lying there on the floor right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, real concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn-Dixie employees turned around and looked at me. I knew I had done something big, and maybe silly too, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air and looked at me like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again. And then I figured that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world, that he would want to get called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was, so I just said the first thing that came into my head. I said, "Here, Winn-Dixie." and that dog came trotting over to me, just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. It's his name, I said, honest. The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into a grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "He got in by mistake. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "Come on, Winn-Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking, and he followed along behind me as I went out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle and past all the cashiers and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful, and he didn't look that good. He was big but skinny. You could see his ribs, and there were bald patches all over him, places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly, he looked like a big piece of old brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did that thing again, where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know, I'm a mess. Isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and Winn-Dixie, started walking home. Chapter 2. That summer, I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so, in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that is how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I just had moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. "But you know what?" I told Winn-Dixie. "You are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me help you and keep you." Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk. Bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mr. Detwiller's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. "Sit," I told him when he got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. "Stay here," I told him. "I'll be right back." The preacher was sitting in the living room. Working at the little fold-out table, he had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he is thinking hard. "Daddy," I said. He said back. "Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves?" "Mm-hmm," he said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. "Well," I said, "I found a less fortunate at the grocery store." "Is that right?" he said. "Yes, sir," I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, and they're thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Okay. Notice how Opal says the less fortunate instead of calling Winn-Dixie a dog. I wonder how this is going to go, because she doesn't tell her daddy that she found a dog. She calls him less fortunate. I wonder how that's going to go. Let's see. "Daddy, I was wondering, Could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn-Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray if I've ever seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears. And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked, real soft to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess you've found one. And that ends chapter 2. We will continue reading chapter 3 and 4 on Friday. So, my friends, I hope that you guys kind of heard and listened to any of the possible connections you could have made and because of Winn-Dixie in the first 2 chapters. I mean, we already made one on the first page in the chapter 1. So hopefully you guys were able to kind of just see a little bit more into making connections. And you guys will be completing a Because of Winn-Dixie chapter 1 and 2 quiz for me after watching this video. So if you guys need any help with anything, just let me know and I'll be here. All right, guys, I'll see you later. Bye.